Hi, this is Chris Hoy. Thank you for joining me on Create with Chris for this acrylic painting tutorial. Today I'm going to be showing you how to easily paint this layered Santa mug plaque, step by step from start to finish. So let's get started. This plaque uses acrylic paint, a few brushes, and some sparkle. Whether you are a beginner or painting for fun, this is quick, easy, and impressive. I am using the Santa mug kit, which is a set of 3 pieces and a stencil. Because this is MDF, I'm going to seal it with multi-purpose sealer. I'm using an 1.5-inch wash. I love this brush because I can cover a large area very smoothly. It has super soft bristles, makes it really nice to spread on evenly and quickly. And on the back piece, I only sealed the area where his face is showing. I didn't go clear to the edges on the back. On this front piece, I'm just being a little bit careful so that I pull the brush toward the edges. That kind of eliminates any paint or medium dripping over the outer edges. Try to keep those as clean as possible. Just makes it a little bit easier when you're finished. You don't have to go back, touch up those side edges. After it dries, and I did dry it well with a heat tool, just give it a quick buff with super soft sandpaper and brush it clean. Marking the edges of the face, I need to base coat the face area, but it's silly to do the whole thing. I just need to do that area where that's going to be showing. I'm using warm beige, which is a flesh tone color, and my oval wash. I love using this brush. It has rounded edges on the bristles instead of like a flat. Flats have a square edge. This has a rounded edge. To apply the paint, I want to get it on nice and smooth. I'm using kind of a slip slap stroke, but I'm not so much using the chisel edge of the brush. Kind of lay it down flat so you're getting the flat of the brush, not just that chisel edge. Because this is going over a darker background, I did have to go back, and I think I did a total of 3 coats of paint to give a nice opaque base coat. Make sure that it is completely dry in between each color. And I felt it was a little bit rough, so I did lightly sand after the first coat. Then I applied 2 more. I'm just taking my white chalk marker, tracing the edges of the actual face so that I know where to add my shading. Using my 1/2-inch angle and a little bit of dried clay. Mostly want to shade below the brim and down the sides. And I have a lot of moisture in my brush. Just makes it so easy to go back and float that color around, smooth it out. I only have paint on the toe of my brush. That gives me the ability to use the clean edge, which is on the slanted end, to kind of blend that paint out. Because it is so wet, I can move it around for a long time. Putting the top on to see if I missed any places, and I did, so I'm going to give it another quick dry with my heat tool, and then I can go back and touch up those little corners. It's always best to double check instead of waiting until it's finished and noticing that, oops, I didn't do that area. Again, just have a little bit of paint on the toe, and then I can use the heel to blend it out. I put the mustache in place so I could get my eye placement, and I sketched it on with a white chalk pencil, put a dot in the center of the eye. That dot gives me a good visual for placement. Using an egg stencil, I like the oval with kind of a pear shaped. It's not just a round, just a little more whimsical. And I am stenciling it. 2 light coats is always better than 1 heavy coat. Make sure it's dry, and then I did add a second coat. The eyes are so important, and I do like to spend a little more time on the eyes. A little bit of white, snow white on the toe of my angle, just kind of scooping it around the bottom and up the right side of each eye. Just a soft little float, and that will give him a little glimmer of like eye glassiness or wetness. Couple little dots of Snow White in the top left side. I'm using my stylus. And then I want to add a little tiny comma stroke in the bottom right. Also using my stylus dot, drag it out. You'll get a perfect comma stroke every single time. Tracing in the eyebrows. I love using the chalk pencil because it removes so easily. I'm using slate gray and my number 5 radical round. And this is a brush that I had designed just for me. It's an awesome brush. It has a nice little sharp point on it, but you can also flatten it and use it almost like a filbert. It's just very, very versatile. I like his eyebrows to be bushy. I don't think that Santa should have manicured eyebrows. I like that kind of shaggy look. And while that's drying, I'm just going to take a little bit of that dried clay, which is what I shaded around the top. His face is super flat, but if you add a little bit of shading around the eyes, just adds a little more dimension. Just that little bit of paint makes such a big difference. And I think that should be my motto. I say that a lot. Also want to add some underneath the eyebrows as well. Watermelon slice, my favorite color, makes beautiful cheeks. Using my spectacular stencil brush, another brush that I had designed just for me. The bristles are super, super soft. Great for stenciling, but also it's perfect for dry brushing. When I dry brush the cheeks, I do them both at the same time. If you've ever added one cheek and then tried to make the other one match, often they're lopsided. So if you build the color up on both of them, then it's so much easier to get the same balance. That one was a little bit high, so I just wiped it back a touch. Put my little nose in there to make sure that I don't have any empty spots. You can put as much blush or as little blush. It's just super easy with this spectacular stencil brush to have perfect control on those cheeks. Now I'm going back with my number 2 radical round. I used number 5 to lay in the heavier slate gray color. And Snow White is, oh, I would say a little bit translucent, so you can always see through it. It takes several coats to make it opaque, which is perfect for this technique because I can go in and add layers of eyebrow hairs and brighten it as I want. And that slate gray beneath it, because it's so dark, it's just going to really give a good background shadowed area. Wanted to add a couple snowflakes on his cheeks. I thought that would be whimsical, but I want to make sure they're in the right place. So I'm using my chalk pencil. It's just perfect to mark anything and make sure that it's going to show and not be tucked behind the mustache. Once you get your stencil in place, I loaded my spectacular stencil with Snow White. I always brush it over a paper towel to remove excess. That helps to ensure that you're going to get clean, crisp edges. And then stencil it on very lightly. 2 coats, 3 coats, always, always better than one heavy coat. Just ensures those crisp, clean edges, and that's what you want when stenciling. Now that I have the snowflakes on there, my eyebrows are looking a little bit dull. So I'm going to go back and add another layer, and just to let you know that I probably am going to be adding a couple more to keep it bright. My Santa doesn't have gray hair. He has white hair with shadows in it, and that's exactly what I want it to look like. If it's too gray or too much of the gray background is showing, you get different results from that. Using my number 2 radical round, just kind of staying on the tip of it so I have that sharp point, which it also gives me finer little hairlines. I think that looks pretty good. Now I picked up some lamp black using my Epic 18-aught script liner. Going to add some little tiny eyelashes, no more than 3 or 4. And you can also use a black micron pen for this as well, if that's easier to work with. I'm using my 1/2 inch angle to base coat the nose, warm beige, same color as the face, and just giving a nice shape to that. After I get that base coated on, I'm going to use the same technique that I did for the eyebrows and base coat the mustache with that slate gray. I like to use my angle to base coat with. I like that pointed toe. It gives me the ability to kind of tuck that brush in little corners and places that maybe a flat or a filbert would be a little bit awkward to get into. Again, I'm pulling the paint toward the edges. That way my edges stay nice and clean. And I don't have to worry about cleaning them up when I'm finished. I loaded my number 5 radical round with Snow White, and it is thin so I can pull it on nice and smoothly, staying pretty much on the point of the brush, stroking it, following the contour of the mustache, stroking it toward the tips. And I know that I'm going to have some shading underneath the nose, so I'm not going really tight up against the nose. Layers, that's the secret. If you add layers and have fluid paint so that you can do nice long strokes, that's what's going to make it look good. Now I know it looks like I'm painting it solid, but with this slate gray background, layers and layers and strokes of paint, that slate gray is going to resonate and create those automatic shade lines. As it dries, you're going to see it, and he's going to have a white mustache. I don't want a gray mustache with white streaks in it. Just add those layers. Try to have smooth strokes. Pull it down. If your paint is fluid enough, you should be able to pull those strokes completely down. Loaded the toe of my angle with that dried clay, shading along the bottom, more so on the right side to add a little roundness to the nose. Make sure that it is dry. Using just a little bit of paint makes such a big difference. And because you don't have much paint, it doesn't take long for it to dry either. A little bit of Snow White to highlight and brighten that top and middle section of the nose. Smooth it in. Loaded my Epic script liner with Snow White just to pull a comma stroke across the top of the nose. Just adds a little more, oh, it's so cute, adds a little more highlight there. Now I am back to the background, and all of the area in the background has been sealed with the multi-purpose sealer and sanded using slate gray on the areas that are going to be the beard and the furry texture area. Just going to give a nice base coat. Using the same technique that I did for the face, my oval wash. I love those rounded edges. It doesn't give me that. Sometimes you get that straight edge stop and start place. I never have that with the oval wash. It just gives me a really nice, soft, blended, even background for the base coat. And pulling the paint toward the edges is going to help prevent that paint from running down. And the video is sped up a little bit just to eliminate all the time for base coating and drying. So keep in mind that it does take a little bit longer than the video to apply the paint and make sure that it is dry between layers. Because this is a darker color on a darker background, I only had to apply one coat. Just make sure that it's nice and even. I had some little bit of dried paint. I think it was from the cap of my bottle that ended up in my paint. So make sure that if there's any roughness, I used to teach kids classes, and I said, if you put your paint on lumpy, it's going to dry lumpy. So make sure that it's nice and smooth. After you get the base coat on, you can always, after it's dry, always check it. If it's a little bit rough, just hit it lightly with fine grit sandpaper. If you have a smooth surface, your brushes are going to last longer. They don't like going over those rough surfaces. And I am base coating the handle with melon. I want it to be red, but red is a little bit translucent. If I apply several layers of red, it's just going to be dark. By putting the brighter melon color on underneath as a base coat, when I apply the red, it's just going to really be bright and more festive. Back to the Snow White. Make sure it is dry. Always between layers, make sure it is dry. And you can tell if it's wet, it has a little bit of shine to it. If you lay your hand on it, you'll see I put my hand on it often. I can feel if it's cool, then I know it's not super dry. Okay, adding the hair for the beard is just a process. This is where you need to put pretty music on and just be patient because it does take a little bit. I do pull it from the top down, and because you can't put enough paint in your brush to do long strokes from the top to the bottom, when you stop, stagger where you stop and start so that you don't have like a line across where you stopped every time. Going to be using many layers to fill the beard in because I want it to be white and not gray. So that if I stagger my stop and start lines, by the time I get the final layer on, the beard is going to be very bright white with a little bit of the gray creating the shadows in the background. And it's going to work really well. Make sure to have enough moisture in your brush that you can pull that paint and really load your brush up well so that you don't have to load as often. Just saves time. Also makes your strokes more continuous, which overall looks better. It's nice to put on, I think it's easier for me to put on layers instead of doing one side super heavy and then working over. I do the whole thing with one layer and then I can go back and add another layer and build it up all together. This is not hard to do, it just takes a little bit of time. Stay on the point of the brush. If you start pressing down, it's going to become very thick, wide strokes. You want to keep those finer lines, kind of stay consistent. Instead of pressing down, just reload your brush. If your brush does not have enough moisture in it, it's not going to flow well, and you will know it kind of drags. And that's when you start pressing down and it becomes a wider, thicker stroke. So just stay up on the tip, reload often, load your brush well, have enough moisture in it that you can do quite a few strokes before you have to reload. The paint is always brighter when it's wet. And as it dries, it becomes a little bit translucent, so you can actually see where you need to go back and build up colors. Now that I have the first layer on pretty even, the second layer is going to be a little bit stronger, and I can intensify the color. Again, it needs to be bright white and not a gray beard. work on the fur, and I'm using a brush called a texture graining brush. It's similar to an old-fashioned mustache brush, and I have just pounced it on my palette into Snow White. Pounce it hard enough that it will open up the bristles, and then lightly touch it on the surface. It creates this beautiful, fluffy fur-like effect. It's great for foliage, bushes, fur, grass. It's just absolutely wonderful. Just tap it until it's covered. I'm not going to go super heavy. I did decide that I wanted the pom-pom in front of the beard instead of behind the beard, using my oval wash, which is perfect to slide around and create that circle. Applying watermelon slice over top of the melon base on the handle. These two color combinations look so beautiful together. Had I just used watermelon slice on the darker background, it would be a very dull color, but over top of this melon, it just resonates and it's very, very festive. One coat should be sufficient. Put it on nice and smooth. When using the texture brush, that paint's going to be always a little bit thicker. Keep that in mind. It's going to take a little bit longer to dry. Giving it a quick dry with my heat gun. Decided I wanted to add dip dots. I'm using the handle end of my brush. The size of the handle would determine the size of the dot. I always dip after each dot so the dots are the same size. If you don't reload your handle, they'll be different size dots. Adding a little texture on the pom-pom. A little bit of Payne's Gray, and this is just a little bit of Payne's Gray. Need to add a little shading underneath the eyebrows. Scooting my brush along the bottom edge and then pulling the bristles up into the eyebrow hairs, following the direction of the eyebrow hairs, just really makes a huge difference. Be careful. Payne's Gray is a very powerful color. Too much will definitely turn it blue. We just want that look of a shadow. Doing the same thing with the mustache, scooting my paint underneath the nose and then down the center, and then allow those bristles, the toe of that brush, to kind of pull that color down into the mustache. Switching back to the handle now, a little bit of deep burgundy to darken a little bit against the brim and along the bottom edge of the handle. Same thing above the pom-pom and along that right side. Just add a little bit of shading in there. These little touches make such a big difference. Always dry between each layer. Deepen that shading with just a hint of Payne's Gray. It pulls that same shadow color into the handle. I decided I didn't like the shading over top of the dip dots, so I just went back to brighten them with another layer of paint. Just added a dip dot right on top of that. Keep an eye, any areas that need touched up along the way, stop and touch them up that way, because you'll forget at the end. Switched over to a 3/4 inch angle to add that Payne's Gray shading along the bottom edge of the brim. It's a much larger area and I need to float it out or just have that blended very softly. Don't do a solid shade. I just kind of wiggle my brush, pull it up into the fluffy areas, wiggle the brush underneath the brim, pull it down into the beard. Just a hint of color, a lot of moisture on the brush so it can move around very easily. More can always be added later, but boy, to try to pull some of that heavy color off can be a chore. Just keep it nice and soft, and I like the word quiet. A little bit of paint makes a big difference. Just float across the bottom, pull it up, pull it up, pull it up. I call it my wiggle float. Need to separate that pom-pom out from the beard. Keep blending it in until you have a good contrast and it's divided well. Make sure all the areas are separated well. I think it looks pretty good, but what I noticed is everything's still a little bit flat. So I'm going back in with some of the Snow White just to brighten the top edge of the pom-pom. Look how much more that, what a difference that makes. It makes it look much more rounded. Going to brighten up the top edge of the brim as well, pulling it down. I can put some in the shaded areas, not as heavy, but I think that shaded area is a little bit strong. I like that look of fluffy over top of it, so I just very lightly add a little bit, and then I can use those little loose bristle edges to kind of spill over, and it kind of looks like that fur is fluffy, hanging over the handle, hanging down into the beard just a little bit, not too heavy. But I didn't like that solid edge, so I just let a little bit of that fluffiness spill over. This is where you can spend your time kind of fluffing and puffing, and not so much in the whole process of each individual aspect of this design, but these are the parts that will be noticed. I decided I needed a little mouth in there, so I'm marking the peak underneath his mustache, that little point, and the bottom lip. And it creates a rounded little triangle with a rounded bottom. Painting the upper part, not the lip, but the upper part with deep burgundy. And I'm using my Radical Round and Melon to paint the lip. And it's just one stroke, like a little half circle. Keep it simple. Give it a little bit of a dry. Going to deepen the inside of the mouth with a second coat of deep burgundy. And then at the very point where it is the darkest, I'll add just a little hint of Payne's Gray. On the bottom lip, we don't want it pink, so I'm pulling some watermelon slice mostly across the bottom edge. Let that top edge be a little bit brighter. Another quick dry. A little bit of paint makes a big difference. Deepen that bottom edge one more time with watermelon slice. Blend it in just a touch. Make that lip shimmer. Pull a little bit of white across the top edge. Just looks like it's glistening a little bit. He needed that little bit of a smile. Just looking a couple places to touch up. The mustache seemed a little bit dull after we brightened everything up. And that's what I'm saying, when you do one area, don't consider it finished until you have everything built up around it. So now that the beard has been created, the mustache needs to be just a little bit wider. And you can see that it just was not quite as strong of a white as was the beard. So just touching it up with adding some more Snow White to brighten it up. Still going to be able to see that the lines throughout. With each layer that is applied, it just becomes a little stronger here and there. Doesn't quite cover it up. Thought his nose needed to be a little more rosy, so I floated some watermelon slice along the bottom and right side. The top of the brim, just a little bit of thinned Snow White. And this is not a solid opaque coverage, but just a little hint of Snow White. I'm going to be putting the letters there, and I wanted them to be a little bit brighter in the background and not so busy. And that just softened it down just a little bit. You can still see all the fur and the fluff. Same thing on the eyebrows as the mustache. Once I put everything together, the eyebrows just needed a little bit of brightening. I use my Epic script liner in Snow White because I can add some real fine details, and it's always these little touches that make it quite impressive. So just adding a few details makes it look like you spent hours on the eyebrows. Time for the stenciling. I am positioning the stencil and always secure it with painter's tape, because if it moves around while you are stenciling, it can be really messy. Make sure it is in the correct spot and then just anchor it down. You won't have to worry about it at all. I am using my Spectacular stencil brush. Again, this is a very soft bristled stencil brush. You'll get a beautiful stencil with it. It's easy to use. You can dry brush with it. You can get perfect results very easily. So I loaded my brush, wiped it over a paper towel to remove excess paint, and then lightly tap it on the surface. It's always better to add 2, even 3 coats as opposed to 1 heavy coat. And just a light tap tap. Now this stencil has little snowflakes in the middle of the O. I decided I didn't want those on there, so I just used my finger. I should have put a piece of tape down, but I just used my finger to lay over top of the snowflake so I wouldn't accidentally stencil part of it. And then I have my little painter's pals that I use to lay across the top and the bottom edges as I stencil. I'm really messy, so this kind of ensures that I'm not going to accidentally stencil in some place that I'm not supposed to. And I just scooch it down, hold it in place. Just have to be careful not to get that little O or snowflake in the O accidentally covered. Finger works great. Now I did put 2 coats on. I'm only going to show one, but I put 2 coats on like magic. It's finished, and we can lift it up and see how perfectly that looks. Nice, clean, crisp edges. Take your time. You can't go fast and get good results. Oh, it looks great. I thought the letters needed some whimsy, so I added graduated dip dots. So I load my stylus, dot, 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 and then reload. I wanted to add sparkle on the snowflakes on his cheek. I did go ahead and varnish this with ultramatte varnish before I added the sparkle, repositioning the snowflake, and I'm stenciling using the Starlight varnish. And you can use any varnish. I really like the Starlight because it has sparkle in it, and if I don't get my glamour dust evenly, then that sparkle kind of fills in any voids. But I'm tapping it over the snowflake lightly but evenly. Lift it up while it's still wet. Immediately sprinkle with the glamour dust. Absolutely beautiful. I love it's just an iridescent glitter that is very fine, very delicate, makes his cheeks glow. I decided I wanted the ho 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 to have a little bit of sparkle on it as well. So I repositioned the stencil and taped it down. I worked quickly, but by the time I stenciled the whole entire ho ho ho, the first part had started to dry a little bit. So I would recommend maybe doing half of the letters and then adding the glamour dust and then doing the other half because I did not work fast enough. but just that little bit of glamour dust on the lettering was, it just adds so much. It's so pretty. Working quickly. And I always put a paper underneath so that I can funnel the excess glitter back into the bottle. And I've had a bottle of glamour dust for several years. It just, a little bit goes a long way. And just let it dry. Once it dries, then I take a really soft brush, maybe a mop brush, and brush the excess glitter off. I had a couple places that had dried, so I went back and touched them up. There is my finished piece. I did add a little bit of glamour dust to the pom-pom, just kind of mostly along the top side to make it sparkle as well. I think this plaque would look great on a door, a wall, or a wreath. It would make a wonderful gift. I love how it turned out and hope you give it a try. Remember, all the links for everything used in this video are listed below. Don't forget to check out my other videos. Please share, like, and subscribe to my channel. Remember to hit the bell to be notified when my next video is created. I hope you learned a few new tips, tricks, and techniques to make your painting life a little easier and a lot more fun. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to our next painting adventure together.